All right, how's everybody doing today? Okay, we got one. That's good. I was like, oh no, this doesn't bode well. I'm actually doing all right. But there comes a time in the semester, and it's sometimes earlier, sometimes later, when I ask that, and people just stare at me with giant eyes, and I get concerned for your mental health. So I scrolled through the document y'all were working on in your groups on Tuesday. And it looks like maybe one group finished, but the other ones need some more time. If you were in the group that finished, definitely feel free to just chat about Dexter and think about the film or the pilot itself. Yeah, it looks like some groups just need like a couple more minutes to look over a couple things. So if you don't remember who was in your group, I do have it up here, or if you follow the link from Blackboard for assignment 3, your name should be on your group. If you weren't here on Tuesday, you can just sort of jump in with a group and chat with them. So I'll give you guys about 5 to 10 more minutes to talk about that, and then we're going to have each group talk about Dexter from their theories perspective. So go ahead and move your seats, do what you need to do to get near your group members again and talk through things. I know that we got really used to in the time of Zoom, like just everybody on their computers typing really quietly, but like the hope in group work is that you'll actually like be talking about this stuff out loud. So go ahead, get up, switch your seats, find your group, and we'll go from there. Yeah, again, if your group is finished, you can just talk about the theories in general, talk about your lives. That's cool. I know that like all of our skills for socialization have gone out the window in the past few years, but it's okay to just chat with people, I promise. And I found 3 copies of our book, so if anyone wants to grab one to use, feel free. All right, it looks like folks are finishing up, so take another minute or two to do so. Alrighty, let's go ahead and get started. So thanks for engaging with this. I know this is a little different than some of our other assignments that we've done so far. We'll do a couple like this throughout the semester. So at one point, we're going to watch like a 60-minute segment and you'll respond in this way. When we watch Detroit 187 and when we watch 12 Angry Men, we'll do the same thing. All right, so group one was Cameron, Sadie, and Jasmine, who I think is on Zoom today. So what I'm going to have each group do is just go through all of the questions and tell us about everything. So what is your group's assigned theory and what does it say?
So our group's assigned theory were the sociological theory. Sociological theory bases individual behavior off of social and cultural influences. So our group's theory would explain Dexter's criminal behavior as being a product of sociological theories and environmental theories. Our theory would explain how he interacts with his friends and family because his foster father found an outlet for those tendencies. So like, for example, it's him like killing animals and stuff. So this made it okay for Dexter to accept and simultaneously hide this part of himself. So he creates a disassociation between the self he shows Deb and his coworkers, the self that he comes out with going. Our group said that his psychological state seems to be planned out and organized while also manic. His behavior would most likely be explained as being a sociopath or psychopath. He's a self-prescribed serial killer because of the ideology given to him by his father. He does not see himself as the same as other serial killers. We kind of said that this theory might explain part of why he a part of his behavior, because like I mentioned earlier, his dad kind of not like encouraged to kill, encouraged killing.
You can say encouraged.
Yeah,
I like told him to do it.
So I mean that obviously plays a big role into it, but I do feel like we feel like there might be some other like biological explanations as well.
Yeah, and this is a spoiler for a show that's, I think about a decade old, but you find out later that, his dad kind of just refers to like, before you came to live with us, well, what he witnessed was his father murder someone very violently, like blood everywhere. And it turns out he has a brother who's also a serial killer. So yeah, is that biological? Is that environmental? Probably some mix of both, right? But yeah, it's sort of an interesting thing where his dad's this cop who's like, these bad people keep getting away. So what can we do? Let's use this as like a superpower. It's a very interesting nuance, right? Yeah. Excellent. Thanks, guys. All right, the biological theories.
This includes a lot of genetic vulnerabilities and neurological abnormalities. It's really biologically like how you're born, like your DNA and genetics.
Alrighty, and how would your group's theory explain Dexter's criminal behavior? Yeah, and one of the things we'll do later is I have a book written by a child psychologist who's worked with children like Dexter. And he sort of describes it as like they feel this drive to do it, right? It's really interesting, kind of similar to how Dexter described it as like dark passenger. Yeah, how would your group's theory explain how he interacts with his friends and family?
So we said this theory explains the interaction. Regularity, so you guys are like, they call him kind of have a state of, an altered state of mind, which makes him act a certain way. So it said that like he doesn't feel any remorse because he chooses his actions and emotions, frustrating like his coworkers, his wife, and children.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and this could go to anybody in the class. What were some of the things he did to like try to fit in that you saw in that first episode? Like, what did he do when he went into the station?
Oh, like bringing it up.
Yeah, bring everybody donuts. You seem like the nice guy, right? But then the box, it's like a little on the nose, right? He's like empty, like me inside. You're like, okay, guys. Right. But yeah, this idea that like he does sort of superficial things to get along. So he'll take Rita out for dates because he knows that's what you're supposed to do. But if there's a crime scene, he'll just sort of ditch her for the crime scene, right? Yeah. All right, and what does your group's theory say about Dexter's psychological state?
Especially if you kind of like grab like the brothers, the serial killer, and like the dad, it's like a murderer, it can also kind of support like a chemical imbalance or genetic vulnerability that causes mutation, or even possibly be born with this. And it kind of talks about that being said, like he can't resist these temptations. They're either written, like they're kind of like written DNA or genetic to do it. And then there's also like they talked about in the text how like PED acronym that like correlate with like delinquent youth that be kind of like where it's like kind of got it from his side.
Yeah, definitely. Alrighty, and then did you all agree with how your group's theory explains Dexter and why not? Yeah, and again, especially finding out later in the series that his brother's also a serial killer, right? That sort of, and even if we're talking about environmental factors like witnessing that murder affecting him, not every person who witnesses a traumatic event becomes a serial killer, right? So that does suggest there's probably something biological going on. All right, the psychological theories of crime. Go ahead and tell us a little bit about your group's assigned theory.
So the definition is that is the individual differences in the way people think about their behavior, which I think is like the first thing I was thinking about was like psychologically what was wrong with them, because it seemed so obvious. Psychopath or sociopath or something else.
Yeah, and so we'll talk about that and what the difference or not differences between those in a little bit. But yeah, the psychological theory says everything that's happened to this one individual, right, can affect you. And so that becomes, really important later on. Alrighty, and how would your group's theory explain Dexter's criminal behavior?
So the book went in depth with psychopathy,
Mm.
so I said I would assume that the concept of psychopathy applies to the behavior, because the definition of the theory deals with how Dexter thinks or feels about his behavior. He doesn't really feel anything and is able to deal without pain. really would feel. Psychopathy is a good explanation because one of the traits involves laughter.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, yeah, when he's like talking about he doesn't understand why people do things or say things like, why does my lieutenant wink at me? He doesn't understand these mating rituals, right? That's a big like psychopathy indicator. Yeah, excellent. So how would your group's theory explain how Dexter interacts with his friends and family?
He, I said Dexter has like inherited personality traits. When he was younger, his dad used to tell him, like when he would have these urges to come to him and would encourage him to do it for good. So I kind of also think that this like has an effect on how he is towards his loved ones and always says he doesn't have feelings because he didn't like feeling for his girlfriend. I think this theory just is why Dexter isn't able to be in.
Yeah, definitely. And then you guys kind of already talked about his psychological state, so I won't make you repeat that. You've been doing a really nice comprehensive job. But did y'all agree with how your group's theory explains Dexter and why not?
Yeah, I think that we came to the agreement that psychopathy, works for Dexter because it refers to individuals that engage in frequent repetitive criminal activity to live for no purpose. And from an early age, he struggled with killing living things, starting and then eating them.
Right, and like feeling like it was right? Like he was like, well, the dog was keeping mom up at night. And all the rest of us are like, you just it's like tell your neighbor to get the dog to shut up. You don't kill it, right? But like to him, that made logical sense. Yeah. Alrighty, group 4, the social psychological. So this sort of combines the first and the third one we talked about. So tell us a little bit about it.
So, basically, it's very, understanding behavior is very observation and finding.
Yeah, exactly. So basic social learning theory, Bandura's Bobo doll, right? If we think back to that from intro psych. Yeah, and so how would it explain Dexter's criminal behavior?
His job, like, well, I mean, you can see like practicing the training, like figuring out that's better than the last one, and like, I just trying to carry a lot of like the filler in the episode, just kind of like better. Or just kind of do better.
Alrighty, and then, yeah, we can move on to, how would your group's theory explain how he interacts with his friends and family? Right, exactly.
His body can observe that and that's not kind of the fact of his
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, because even if you weren't someone who was a serial killer, right, being exposed to blood spatter as part of your job is going to naturally sort of like desensitize you to it, right? So yeah, that's certainly fueling this in its own way, right? And what does your group's theory say about his psychological state?
It's probably more of that.
No, you're kind of spot on, so that's good. All right, and then did y'all agree with how your theory explained him?
Yeah, he expressed interest in gain knowledge from observing and lives. He was able to apply observations to his personal life with full analysis of his steps in individual time and what he believed was indeed in that specific time. And then he began to what's from the possibility of time, and therefore his fascination.
Exactly, yeah. And like that one police officer gets a creepy vibe from him, right? But no one else does. Which again, I think really lends itself to how much people with antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy, sociopathy, whatever we call it, are really good at hiding things, right? It's all kind of an act. And Julia, I just realized I think you're the only one here for your group. So take it away. Tell us about the integration theory.
So the integration theory of fraud model is pretty much a combination of some of them. They really focus on what are like the best variables for criminal research. So those are normally antecedent conditions, early indicators, developmental process, and maintenance factors.
Definitely. And you could just go on. Yeah.
So our group's theory explained Dexter's criminal behavior. I thought it explained it pretty well, just because you were able to look at all the different variables of the type to kind of like break it down. I think I said it further on, but like
Yeah.
when looking into each variable, like you kind of saw these red flags
Mhm.
that kind of just kept popping up. So whether it was like early life stuff with his father and killing animals, those are kind of what we see as early indicators for somebody that will have problems in the future.
Sure, yeah.
So I thought that, you know, they explained his criminal behavior as like, they all the variables played a different part, but they still contributed to like the final outcome in him. So like how does he interact with his friends and family? So we said that on answers. They said, yeah, it pretty much would explain the environment that he grew up in and how things that he was taught not only were engraved from like his father's perspective, but it's what he thought was right and like the right way to carry things out. So the variables really do show how like each individual part of his life stepping up to interact
Right.
with people. So like we see that especially with the one scene where he's like, or his girlfriend wants to like have sex with him and he's almost like happy that
They get interrupted.
get
Yeah.
her son.
Like, oh, good, your son threw up, right?
Like, I think that shows kind of like his interactions and like how those came to be almost. His psychological state, from this definition, I would say he's in a pretty troubling
Mm.
psychological area. He shows some similarities to individuals with schizophrenia, although I know it's a TV show, so we don't really know like if when he's talking to himself, that's just
Right.
in his own head. But definitely shows some psychopathic tendencies.
Mm.
So that really like stuck out to us. That's like one of the main things we spoke about.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, all the groups are really getting to that, the idea that Dexter is probably a psychopath. Yeah, and that's, you know, that's one of the reasons why I use this is and again, like collapsing it into this one first hour, they kind of hit on a lot of the symptoms of psychopathy, right? So real quick before I dive into the lecture, while you all were working, I thought of an extra credit assignment you could do. If you can't go today, that's fine. I gave you an alternative. So at noon today, so basically like right after class in Brock Commons, the FBI is on campus to do a run, hide, fight training. And one of the things we're going to talk at the end of this lecture is like school shootings. So it's certainly relevant. So if you go, just do a 1-page summary, email it to me, you'll get 5-point extra credit. If you can't go in person, because I'm giving you like ridiculously late notice, there is a video about it on the FBI's website, so you can do the same thing, but just watch the video. So I always like to kind of think of things tied to class and give you all those opportunities. So I was like, oh, wait. So doesn't mean I'm always on top of letting you know about it, but I try. Alrighty, so again, y'all did a really good job. If you want, you can, take a minute to like switch back to your seats while I get the captions going. And then if you want, you can like download the answers the groups had, or just, you know, the link will be available, because I hope to post it by like the start of next week. Your midterm, it'll be a little early to have it posted, but I like to give y'all plenty of time to look it over. And one of the questions we'll sort of ask about similar things about the theories. So this assignment can be a really good reference. So I'm gonna take some steps back in time and talk about how have we viewed crime historically. Well, most ancient explanations of crime took on a religious tone, not surprisingly, because a lot of ancient explanations were about the spirits or deities, right? So crime was either equivalent to or because of sin. So it was tied to sin and sort of punishment was often tied to the church as well. So there were a couple different schools of trying to explain behavior, and these continue today into the field of criminology, which if you're a criminal justice major or minor, there is a class on that you may have taken. So the classical school of criminology emphasized free will to explain criminal conduct. So they said people are choosing to engage in these behaviors. Classical theorists also believe the punishment should fit the crime, right? So we shouldn't be executing someone for like petty theft. The positivist, there we go, school of criminology emphasize factors believed to determine criminal behavior. So the same things your theories just talked about: sociological, biological, psychological, environmental, how those things interact, right? So it used the scientific method and the analysis of empirical data. However, as with many previous decades, centuries of science, the conclusions are not necessarily taken seriously today because, unfortunately, they often come from faulty theories. They didn't have the methods that are available today. So like, even something as simple as fingerprinting didn't initially exist, and certainly not DNA analysis, right? And also, and then this is on psychology almost more than criminology, there were some really messed up eugenicist ideas about people's behavior and criminal behavior in particular. They tried to explain behavior with phrenology, which was like you felt things on the head and that would tell you something. So, even though the idea behind this theory is great, the previous data, like a lot of fields, is something we kind of have to discount. And this one argued that the punishment should fit the criminal, not the crime. So the idea is we should try to rehabilitate this person rather than giving them a lesser punishment for a lesser crime. All right, so y'all did a really good job talking about these, so I'm just going to kind of skim through them. But yeah, just quick example with the biological one, for example, when they look at studies from twins, they find that there might actually be an inherited tendency that predisposes you to commit crime. However, what that often doesn't take into account is that there's often shared environment going on too, right? If you're raised with a twin, like, yes, you might share a lot of your DNA, but you're also probably sharing your environment. So as you all are probably picking up on, and maybe surprising since I'm a psychologist, you think I'd like roll with the psychological theories, but in fact, the integrated theories are really like where it's at now. Alrighty, so several of you mentioned psychopathy, sociopathy. In the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manuals for Mental Disorders, which is what we use to diagnose folks within the psychological field, this is classified as antisocial personality disorder. Now, some researchers do argue that there is a distinction between psychopaths and sociopaths. So the idea is that psychopaths have like the genetic component. It's, they've sort of always been this way. Sociopaths, it might be a trauma or something else in their life that influences them to become this way. Diagnostically, it doesn't matter. Like they would both be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. And the construct, the personality trait that we look at is called psychopathy. So, again, I think that there are probably some meaningful differences that you can look at with these things, but Doesn't matter, were you to be, that person to be sitting across from me and I was their therapist? No. So these people persistently disregard and violate other people's rights. You have to be at least 18 to be diagnosed with this. And this is true for all of the personality disorders. Basically, there's a recognition that teenage years are tumultuous times, right? That there are times when your hormones are going crazy, when high school, middle school are just overwhelming, and you might act like you have a personality disorder, but it's really the environment and it's transient and you're going to get over it, right? That being said, as you'll see in these criteria, there is an acknowledgement that this is long running, deep seated. So a pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of other since at least age 15. And again, this often starts very young. And as we saw with Dexter, like killing animals. One of my interns years ago did some research over at EVMS, and they were going through old files, and some of those children had the precursor to antisocial personality disorder, conduct disorder. I should write that up for y'all too. So if the kid is engaging in these behaviors, you can diagnose them with something before they turn 18. You can give them conduct disorder. And there was one kid who was purposely burning frogs, which sounds just really disturbing, right? So there's this disregard for all life. So they have to have 3 of these 7 symptoms at least. Some of people would have all 7, right? So failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behaviors. So they're repeatedly performing illegal acts, essentially. Deceitfulness. So they're lying, using aliases, conning others for personal profit or pleasure. Impulsivity or failure to plan ahead, which is really interesting because I think a lot of psychopaths do plan, right? Like if you think about how Dexter was with his crime scenes, right? Or if we assume the other serial killer they were trying to track down was also a psychopath, he was very cautious. So again, this is why this is only 1 of 7. Irritability and aggressiveness. It can involve physical fights or assaults. Reckless disregard for the safety of self or others. I mean, again, he works at a police station. And I was just thinking of that whole sequence where he's just murdered this guy. The body's probably in his trunk, right? And then he's chasing down this other ice truck, right? Refrigerated truck. And then he's being interviewed by the police while the other body's probably chilling in his trunk. It's just a little right? And obviously killing other people would be part of that. Consistent irresponsibility, so repeated failure to sustain consistent work behavior or on our financial obligations. Again, Dexter doesn't really have that one. It seems although the docs, I think the guy's name is, he's always wants his report sooner, but it seems like he's pretty dedicated to his work. And then lack of remorse, which several of you mentioned in your group assignment, right? That he didn't seem to feel emotions or guilty about it. So they'll be indifferent to or rationalizing having hurt, mistreated, or stolen from someone else or murdered them. And again, have to be 18. There's evidence of conduct disorder before the age of 15. And it has to be not when they're they can have a co-diagnosis of schizophrenia or manic episodes, but these behaviors can't only occur when they're psychotic or when they're manic. So this has to be a consistent pattern over time, which actually all the personality disorders, that's a big part of this. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about this diagnosis is the vast majority of the diagnoses in the DSM include as one of their criteria, distress or impairment in social, school, work functioning. This one does not include it. We kind of don't care if people with antisocial PD are distressed because they are causing distress to those around, right? And in fact, often they're not distressed by it. They just think it's kind of how they are. So really interestingly, so it's like a little bit of the politics behind psychology that I'll give you a window into here. So when they revised the Diagnostic and System Manual and published it in 2013, it went from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5. There was a working group working on the personality disorders. There's actually one for each group of disorders, but the working group, I think, and personality disorders did some of the most comprehensive work. They like polled the public several times, with the public being people who practice psychology. They really did a comprehensive redo of these disorders. And I think they finished it around October 2012 and presented it to the people who published the DSM. And they said, the publisher said, this is great, but you gave it to us too late. So what they did, and this is why I'm like, was it really too late? Is they put this alternate proposal for personality disorders in an appendix of the DSM-5. So it's in there, but there are just two different sets of criteria for all the personality disorders in the DSM-5, which obviously isn't confusing at all. And they just came out with earlier this year a text revision of the DSM-5, and they still kept it in the appendix. So I don't get that. I actually saw that working group speak at a conference in November of 2012. So they just found this out. And I've like never seen a more demoralized panel at a conference. I felt kind of bad for them. They were like, so we did all this work. And, right. I felt bad for them. But here is sort of the direction they are going with. So making it more specific, so that they have to have impairment, but not the type of impairment we typically think of, but impairment in like identity. So identity would be knowing who they are, knowing how to sort of hold that up. Self-direction, so being able to focus, plan, things along those lines. Empathy is going to be a really obvious one, right? For people who are psychopaths, almost all of them will have a great impairment in that. And also intimacy. And again, we saw that with Dexter, with his relationship with Rita. And you can specify with psychopathic features. And so these would be people who have this disorder, who specifically don't get anxious about things. So if you or I were to commit a crime, right? Let's say we decide to shoplift something. We would probably get really anxious, right? Like we might experience all those physical symptoms of anxiety, or at least mentally being like, oh, I don't know if I should do this, right? People with psychopathic features, like they just don't get that. So that makes doing crimes even easier for them. And then sometimes they're also attention seeking. And then they'll have to have 6 or more of these instead of just 3. So manipulativeness, callousness, not caring about other people, deceitfulness. And again, that can be in seemingly innocuous ways, like, I'm such a good guy. Look at me bringing donuts to the police officers who, I don't know what they do if they found out I'm a serial killer, right? Things along those lines. Hostility towards other people, risk taking. So again, even though Dexter is planful, I wouldn't diagnose him with impulsivity. He's certainly taking risks, as we just talked about, right? And then irresponsibility. So eventually, maybe DSM-6, this will probably be the new criteria for this. And again, they all stem from this trait of psychopathy. The idea that this is something embedded in your personality. And now, like, personality theorists also don't know if personality is biological, sociological, psychological, what have you. Again, sort of an integrated, what they call the biopsychosocial model is what we tend to use more than anything else. Yeah.
I know they talk about like fMRI scans or MRI scans with these people, but are there like noticeable like physical differences in the like makeup of how these individuals like?
That's a really good question. Yeah. Okay. So here is, now granted, this was like a few years ago when I went to this talk at the APA convention. But basically what the speaker I saw then, Scott Lilienfeld, who's like one of the huge names in psychopathy research, psych research in general, he argued that our brain scan science isn't quite there yet. And so we shouldn't be using it for legal decisions. I think there are some differences that come up. The problem is brain scan studies are really expensive. Essentially, if you're gonna do MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, which is functional MRI, MRI itself is like a picture, like an X-ray. fMRI is more like a video or a GIF, however you pronounce that. In order to do that, you either need to buy your own MRI machine, which is like millions of dollars, right? Or you need to pay for time in an MRI machine. And basically, you are paying what like the insurance would pay, not what the patient would pay, right? So that's a lot of money. For that reason, oftentimes the samples for these studies are very small. So like even like a very good fMRI study might only have 20 or 30 people in it. Well, if you only have 20 or 30 people and like one is an outlier, one is like really different brain, when you average them out, it can look like there are differences when there's not. So I think yes, but we can't like definitively say it yet. I think as that technology gets more accessible and as we get better with the science of it, we'll find differences, definitely. Yeah, that's a really good question. And actually, yeah, before we get into like, how do you diagnose this? I'll read for, okay, so let me give you a little backstory on this guy. So this guy, again, child psychologist, his name is Jonathan Kellerman. You may have heard of him because he also writes murder mysteries. And his wife, Faye Kellerman, and then his son, whose first name I'm forgetting, are now also murder mystery authors. I think his wife was already. And they're like loosely based on his own life in terms of like, he used to be a child psychologist. And I'm not sure if he ever consulted with the police or not, but the main character in his books is this child psychologist who like consults with the police on murders. And so he wrote this book about kids with essentially conduct disorder, kids who show the trait of psychopathy. And he called it Savage Spawn, Reflections on Violent Children. And so this, I'm going to just read you a couple passages from here that shows you a little bit about, again, kind of going with what Julia was just talking about, how different these folks are. This is not to say that all children with violent tendencies are psychopaths, but young psychopaths comprise a substantial portion of the children who devolve into serious hardened criminals. And what criminals they become, the cruelest, most calculating felons. Blithe killers, strong-arm virtuosos, industrious career miscreants viewing crime as their profession, unfettered by conscience, just what we just talked about, right? Or convention, or the threat of punishment. Oh, that's something I didn't mention. If you punish a psychopath, they don't learn from it. So like when psychopaths go to prison, they just like come out and do their crimes again. And in fact, like one of the worst things you can do is do group therapy with a bunch of people with psychopathy, because they just learn from each other. Like they don't get any better. They're just like, that's a good idea. So yeah, don't do it. Not recommended. So yeah, and these people are just like not going to change, whether it's because of biology or whatever. Yeah.
So like, what do you do?
We're still trying to figure that out. You know, if it's somebody who's a serial killer, hopefully we put them away for life, right? But then you get the weirdness, right? Like, is it Dahmer that people decided was really hot and like women wrote him letters in prison and stuff? And like you get this weirdness and notoriety around serial killers, or like almost become, and it's like that's encouraging them too. That's not helpful. Yeah, I mean, there are people who work in this field who are trying to come up with stuff you can do. But my impression is there's not a lot that works well, essentially, unfortunately. Let's see. They wreak misery and pain on the rest of us. They're not spurred by poverty or rage against one machine or the other. Although these factors may play a role in their development, they do it because they love it. They do it because they can. Prison keeps them away from the rest of us, but once they get out of prison, the recidivism rate is significantly higher than that of other released convicts. They don't stop being bad because they don't want to stop being bad. If they live past the age of 50, their criminal behavior does tend to taper off, but more for lack of energy than because of any moral repair. They are capable of dishing out some nasty surprises at any age. And then psychopathic tendencies begin very early in life. They can begin as young as 3. So again, that's why I like that scene where Dexter's probably like 8 or so talking to his dad, right? You see it would happen very young, and then they endure. The same goes for pathological aggressiveness. One study of coldly, cruelly aggressive children produced clear evidence of violence beginning around the age of 6.5. Several reviews of childhood murderers revealed strong patterns of pre-homicidal violence by early adolescence, with some kids manifesting frightening tendencies as young as 2. Violent sexuality and psychopathology don't always go together, but when violent sexual imagery is tossed into the psychic mulch that twists the roots of an antisocial youngster, you can tell by this guy is a well-loved writer. He has a way with words, right? The strangler vine that pokes through often sprouts into a monstrosity. So that's, you know, the guy that Dexter kills during this episode, the guy who was into like the snuff films, right? That's that as well. Sexual psychopaths learn to manipulate and victimize early, sniffing out vulnerability and weakness with the acuity of heat-seeking missiles. They begin with victims who can't complain. Animals and hone their skills tormenting, killing, and mutilating before they move on to human prey. They're the bullies, the stalkers, the malicious sneaks, the smooth victimizers like Bundy. It's Ted Bundy, I think. Yeah. Able to morph from disarmingly charming conversationalists into purveyors of violence so suddenly that it stuns and incapacitates their victims well before the horror of what's really happening sinks in. We are rarely, if ever, prepared for them because their capacity for cruelty stretches far beyond the limits imposed on our imagination by civilization. We don't think as they do. When confronted by the spectacularly grotesque expressions of psychopathy, we engage in armchair psychiatry, mouthing seemingly logical platitudes such as, "They're crazy. You'd have to be crazy to cut off someone's head and freeze it." I actually wrote this way before Dexter even came out. Or mutilate a 10-year-old or shoot up a schoolyard. Defense attorneys capitalize it, but it's a lie. You don't have to be crazy. Psychopathic killers are anything but crazy. And so we'll get more into this later in the semester, but we've already kind of touched on this a little. Insanity is a legal term rather than a medical diagnosis, and it varies in definition from state to state. But all concepts of insanity have in common the notion that the insane criminals suffer from a biologically mediated inability to distinguish right from wrong and or an inability to assist in their own defense. Psychopaths know what they're doing. Sometimes their motive is nothing more than the alleviation of boredom, and they get bored easily. Other examples in pop culture, Anthony Hopkins in Silence of the Lambs, as well as if you've seen Silence of the Lambs, the put the lotion in the basket guy, it's another example of psychopathy. Matt Damon in The Talented Mr. Ripley. You could argue that the Joker probably has this diagnosis, right? Depending on the iteration on who's portraying him. And so this is, and one thing I didn't mention is that there are people who are just quote unquote good at this, and they're never going to get arrested. Like, these are the people who caused the housing bubble on Wall Street, didn't care if people were losing their homes, right? Those people are likely never going to get arrested for that, right? Because it's corporate, it's fine. So they're not all serial killers. We can point that out as well. Alrighty. So how do we diagnose this? How do we assess for this? So one interesting fact is about 80% of people, at least that we recognize with psychopathy, are men. But most offenders are not psychopathic, right? This is very specific. And also, we may miss it in women because of social norms. Women may victimize people in different ways and sort of like behind closed doors. So they may be more likely to abuse their spouse, their children. They also may be more likely to engage in what we call relational aggression. The term slipped for a second, which is basically take the movie Mean Girls and like turn it up to 11. That's relational aggression. So these are the people who like sabotage other people at work and make them lose their jobs. And so I think we're probably missing diagnoses of some women and non-binary folks here. So there are two really well accepted questionnaires. There's the Hare PCL and the PCLR. PCL stands for psychopathy checklist. I know checklist is technically one word. I didn't come up with the acronym. And it's established to measure psychopathy as a risk factor specifically for offending. So these questionnaires don't just hone in on, are you someone who shows psychopathic tendencies? Are you someone whose psychopathic tendencies are going to make you more likely to commit crimes? So what causes psychopathic behavior? As you saw from all your theories, we don't have one good explanation. Again, speaking to some of what Julia was asking about, there seems like there might be a left hemisphere deficiency that impairs executive function. Executive functioning is our ability to plan and regulate our behavior. So executive function is what is keeping you all in your seats right now, when maybe you'd rather be like outside enjoying the nice weather. I feel you, right? Executive function is also what tells you to put your socks on before your shoes, things along those lines. There's also this theory called stimulation seeking theory that claims that the thrill of seeking and disruptive behavior of the psychopath increases sensory input to a more tolerable level. So the idea here is that in order for the psychopath to like feel something or like get enjoyment out of something or get a rush out of something, they have to go to a much higher threshold than those of us without psychopathy. And so like what some of us might get from like hanging out with friends or going on a roller coaster, they have to engage in these really severe violent acts to do. And also there's a lot of evidence suggesting dysfunctional family or other environmental setting may be influential. And as I mentioned previously, there's no diagnostic difference here, but you will hear these terms used both by psychologists and within popular culture. The Benedict Cumberbatch Sherlock Holmes talks about like, I'm not a psychopath, I'm like a functioning sociopath, right? Okay, but it still shows high levels of psychopathy, right? In his case, again, he's harnessing it for good, sort of this Dexter model. And I'm sure there are people out there who have those tendencies who are able to do that. But, you know, we need to keep in mind when we see these media portrayals that, you know, not everybody's a psychopath. It's actually like using those powers for good, right? Again, y'all did a great job with these theories. So what we're going to talk about next is really hard, and I want to fully acknowledge this because this is something that has been a growing problem. And we're going to talk about school violence in particular, but obviously mass shootings more generally, right, have been a growing issue. So I was in high school when Columbine happened. Again, I know that like drastically dates me. But it was very shocking then. I'm sure there had been violence in schools before and maybe even close to that level, but it felt out of the ordinary. It felt different or sinister. And of course, everyone was trying to like exactly what Jonathan Kelleran was describing, be like armchair psychiatrists and be like, well, it was because these kids were isolated, or it was because they played Marilyn Manson music, or they played violent video games. And like, we don't know because the perpetrators also killed themselves after they killed a bunch of their classmates. And that's often common in mass shooter scenarios, is that oftentimes they will kill themselves, or you'll hear the term suicide by cop, where it's like they know that by engaging in these behaviors, they are likely to get killed by a law enforcement agent. And so you will see that as well. These have gone up drastically within, I mean, it's definitely since the 90s when Columbine happened, but I would say even within the past few years. And it's really disheartening and it's really scary. And it's one of the reasons why I'm glad we're having this run, hide, fight training, because like, to be perfectly honest, I have sat and thought, how would I protect you all if there was a mass shooter? We have a giant wall of windows. right? We have a door that like, I don't think it locks from the inside. I guess I could like get you all in my office, like, right? Like, it's just really scary to think about the implications of that. And it's not something I should have to think about, it's not something you all should have to think about, it's certainly something that our kindergartners shouldn't have to think about and do drills for, right? And so that's really disturbing. We also know that these are much higher in the US than other places. And so we need to analyze that as a country. There's not, again, one reason for that. Certainly one is the access to weapons that can kill a lot of people quickly. But we also know there's probably some other things within our culture in terms of glorifying violence, things along those lines. But we don't have good answers, or we would have fixed it by now, probably, right? So this was, again, like 20 plus years ago, 1999 to 2000, 71% of students in public schools reported experiencing one or more violent incidents. So that could be anything from like a cafeteria fight up until a school shooting, right? But 20% reported serious violent incidents, including sexual assault, sexual battery, physical fights with a weapon, or being robbed with or without a weapon. In that same survey, 17% of high school students said that they had carried a weapon at least once in the previous month. So that could include a knife or like a club, but it could also include a gun. And about 6% of the students said they carried that weapon to school with them. In the 2005 to 2006 school year, 17% of public schools experienced at least one serious violent incident at their school. Again, it'd be interesting to see what that percentage is now. A smaller percentage than primary schools, than middle schools or high schoolers experienced violent incidents back in 2005 to 2006. Unfortunately, I don't know how much of a difference there is now, right? I mean, I just think about this case up in Newport News, right, with the 5 or 6 year old who shot his teacher, and Sandy Hook, right? Sandy Hook is just like emotionally devastating when you think about it. And the fact that it's not the only time that someone's gone in and shot little kids, right? I've always been like really disturbed by people who do violence to children, but now that I have a child myself, it like gets to me even more. So I'm not going to apologize, but just sort of like warn you guys, I might get emotional talking about this. I don't think that I should be apologizing for being emotional about children's killed. So we know that boys are much more likely than girls to commit these, especially mass shootings, and this carries over into adults as well, that men are much more likely than women. So again, that speaks to probably something about our society and how we're teaching boys and men to cope with things, right? And it doesn't mean it's universal, but it means it's something that we as psychologists should certainly examine, right? What are we doing? How can we help? There's a really good documentary called The Mask We Live In, The Mask You Live In. But they talk about how like boys are taught to like man up, don't cry. And that if you look at like the history of particularly school shooters, they often have mental health issues, right? And sometimes they've gotten help from them and sometimes they haven't. So characteristics of boys who are responsible for these school ground killings, they usually have more than the usual experience with firearms. And they might even show like a persistent fascination with guns that even kids with exposure to firearms don't show. They're often folks who are isolated, rejected, or tormented by their classmates. Clearly that doesn't blame the classmates, but again, it's something we should think about in terms of like, how are we treating kids to training kids to treat each other, right? Oftentimes they have particularly difficulty relating to girls. Again, this carries out into adulthood. I think it was the Santa Monica shooter, right? Who made like an incel message on his phone and then went and shot up like a bunch of women in a sorority. That's problematic, obviously, right? We shouldn't be seeing anyone of any gender, any race, what have you, as less than human, as someone who's disposable. They also are preoccupied with various forms of graphically violent media. So that doesn't mean it's because of video games or because of music or because of specific internet sites. That's as someone who's like a big advocate for freedom of speech, and they're gonna be like, we should ban Marilyn Manson, right? Because that's why, even if I don't personally like his music, right? But we also know from social learning theory that people will repeat things they see, right? And that can desensitize you to things. I don't know, like the research in terms of direct correlation of like, you play a video game, you go and like actually do violence is not there. But we need to think about sort of like the way our society as a whole views violence, right? Again, even Disney movies, right? There's often like a lot of killing of villains, like the classic, like the villain falls off the cliff right at the end. No justice system going through there, right? So again, this is sort of like callousness that we need to wrap our heads around. A lot of these little boys have suffered from teasing because of their physical appearance. So they're either frail, too thin, or obese, too big. And so that shows that like, we need to just stop with like, as a body image researcher, we need to just stop with unrealistic body image norms in general and acknowledge that there's a range of bodies. They often have a history of angry brooding. So we call this in clinical psychology rumination, where they just go over a thought again and again and again, and they kind of get stuck on it. And this is often over their real or perceived status as an outcast. And then they have usually developed a detailed plan for their aggression. And this is often communicated to others in days or weeks prior, but unfortunately, oftentimes people don't take it seriously. Like people will post manifestos, people will pass like detailed plans, and like either it won't get to law enforcement or law enforcement will dismiss it, right? And so like we as a society need to like take people at their word when they say they're going to do something bad, right? So people have tried to solve this by reforming schools. And again, some of this might be great, but I don't know how much, any one individual thing you can do at a school is going to fix it. So I know, like, for example, up at Newport News, now all their schools have metal detectors. Okay, right, but that's not solving the psychological issues behind what's going on. Or the fact that apparently several people communicated and reported that that kid had a gun that day and no one did anything about it, right? Like, let's work on our communication skills. Let's work on like crisis plans, things along those lines. Some people argue that requiring school uniforms will magically fix it. I don't know how that's supposed to work. If you look like everybody else, maybe you'll get teased less. I don't think so, right? I think teasing still happens in place where there are school uniforms. I mentioned beefing up security measures. A lot of people will argue, oh, we need more good guys with guns in schools. Well, in the shooting in Texas, the good guys with guns ran, right? And then the police officers just stood in the hallway. And again, like, I get where a human instinct is to protect yourself, right? But I think we just need to acknowledge that that's not necessarily the only solution. A lot of people have argued for passing tougher gun laws. I'm not actually sure why this is listed under school reforms. It's sort of a community reform, but we get a lot of resistance to that because of the Second Amendment. And to be perfectly honest, the misinterpretation of the Second Amendment. A lot of people will just cite the right to bear arms piece of it. But it's like, in order to have a well-regulated militia, right? Like, so that the government can't like overthrow us. And so the well-regulated part does suggest that we could have some gun reform, I think. And again, you will hear this over and over, like even Gabby Giffords, who is the congresswoman who was shot through her head and survived somehow. She has said, like, my husband and I are gun owners. I'm not advocating for getting rid of guns. I'm advocating for responsible gun ownership. Makes sense. Offering violence prevention programs in schools. There's mixed bags about these in general. Any kind of prevention programs, you have to be careful you're not giving people a recipe to do something. Like a lot of, I didn't have DARE because I went to a private school growing up, but I've heard from a lot of people that DARE sort of gave you a recipe for how to do drugs. And so you have to watch things like that. I have a friend from college who developed an eating disorder after watching one of those after school specials and be like, oh, I didn't know that was a thing you could do. So we have to be really careful when we do prevention programs that we're not giving people how to use. Also, people have argued restricting access to violent movies. Again, that becomes hard when kids' cartoons. I don't know if anyone in here has ever watched like the classic Looney Tunes. That's like the most violent media I've ever watched, right? It's like cartoonish, and so you don't think about, but you're like, how many times would the coyote have actually died in this episode, right? With the safe and the piano and whatnot, right? And then there's also been this idea of like profiling students, and obviously the idea of profiling anybody always gives us sort of the heebie-jeebies. Because in theory, it should be about people with risk factors, but we know it's often ends up being people who look a certain way, right? And that's not going to help, not be effective. And then increasing communication between students and school administrators. So students can communicate their concerns and know that they won't get in trouble for saying like, hey, so-and-so has a gun, we should probably do something about it. The most prevalent problem with aggression in education settings is actually bullying. And this is within K through 12. And then on college campuses, it's hazing, which I know Wesleyan has a huge anti-hazing campaign right now, which is excellent. And then unfortunately, acquaintance rate as well. And much of this aggression is unreported and therefore underestimated by official records. A lot of people who are sexually assaulted don't come forward. A lot of kids who are bullied don't come forward, right? So zero tolerance policies are this idea that like one strike and you're out. That somehow like giving a kid unlimited freedom by kicking them out of school, somehow it's gonna fix things, right? It's a little like, they're ineffective and have the potential to stigmatize and harm a variety of mistakenly identified individuals. Threat assessment is something that has a lot more promise. So threat assessment is the idea of you look at the nature of the threat, the risk posed by a particular individual, and the needed response to reduce the harm. Threat assessment can also be more abstract. So I mentioned to y'all that I have a friend who's a Virginia Beach police officer, and we don't always agree about everything, but we remain friends. But one of the things he does, and he actually does this both for work and then sort of like in his spare time, is he'll go into places like schools and churches and do threat assessments. Where are your points of vulnerability? Where should you have people kind of looking out on things? Because again, you would think, oh, churches should be fine, but we had the Dylan Ruff case, right? Where he went into a church and did mass murder. We also have things like, this is like a while ago, I think it was in Kansas. There was someone who went into the church of an abortion provider and killed that person as well as several other members of the congregation, right? So not a good Christian thing to do. Sorry, I just get like really annoyed by cynical, hypocritical religious people who are like, yes, I kill in the name of God. And I thought it was thou shalt not kill, right? That should be. So yeah. We don't have a perfect way to handle it, but we certainly are working on it. And that's part of why we're having this training here on campus, which I'm grateful for. And we'll keep doing the best we can. All right, so next week, we're going to start talking about how psychologists get involved with evaluating people who want to be law enforcement officers. All right, thanks y'all for hanging in there for this not so fun discussion.